In the fall of 2002, New York's Fashion Institute of Technology is the place to be if you want a career in fashion. And 18-year-old Janae Aragosa is happy to be counted among the current class.
It was so exciting to be accepted because there was only 25 students who got in for that major. So everything that I could imagine came true when that happened.
Man, I am just one stitch away from finishing this thing, but this leather is too thick. Girl, let me help you. I have a lot of experience with leather.
Oh, no, why does that not surprise me?
Oh, I worked with it with my internship.
With Michael Kors?
Don't be jealous. Man, I'd kill for an internship like that.
You know, we've all been working way too freaking hard. We just need to go out and do something. Get some drinks.
I know just the place. Up in my neighborhood. Cold margaritas, hot guys. You don't have to tell me twice.
Just a few blocks from Janae's Upper West Side apartment is Nacho Mama's, a popular bar and restaurant among college students.
Okay, guys, whose turn to buy beer?
Girl, I am not moving. This lighting is too good. But how about you do it?
I bought the last one.
Guys, look at that bartender. He is fun.
Do you think he's posing for us? He's just really into cleaning that counter.
I said to my friend, I bet you I can get that bartender's phone number by the end of the night. And she just kind of laughed.
But to the surprise of her friends, Janae isn't joking.
I'll go get another pitcher, but you owe me $20 each if I come back with his phone number. Deal. Girl, get it.
Another?
Yeah, thanks.
Though they don't say much, there's an instant connection between Janae and the handsome.
Well, now that I know you're here, I'll have to come by more often.
Yeah. You should give me your number. Next time I'm working, maybe I'll call you, comp you a few drinks.
Better yet, you give me yours.
Okay.
No way.
No. There you go, beautiful.
Thanks. See you soon, Trevor.
She's gonna
Pay up.
Oh my god. You have to tell us everything you said.
Janae wastes no time coming back to the bar, and soon the two are spending almost every night together.
Can I get you anything?
Nothing, I'm good.
He was a handsome guy. Good looks, good physique, good body, very popular with the ladies, and they hit it off really well.
But just a few months in, the budding relationship hits its first bumps.
Oh, hey, Becky asked if we could go out with her new boyfriend next weekend.
I don't know.
Come on. We'll make it easy. We'll eat here.
If he was working and she was going out, he wanted her to come to Nacho Mama's and stay there. If she wanted to go somewhere else, he got pissed off at her.
So you're telling me you like Kate Spade better than Todd's? Seriously?
I didn't say that. I said Kate Spade has more bags in their line that I like.
So, Trevor, do you know much about fashion, or you just smile and nod like me?
No. Trevor definitely doesn't know anything about fashion.
So what is your thing, Trevor? What do you want to do?
Bartend.
Well, yes. Is that all?
Yeah, that's all.
Sorry, it's just I have other friends that bartend and they want to be actors or they're in a band. Not your thing. Okay. What do you guys want to eat?
It was like he wanted to be with me exclusively in that way only, and nobody else could. And that's when things started to go wrong.
What was that all about?
What are you talking about?
You dissing me in front of your friends.
Please, you're being such a stick in the mud. I was just trying to break the ice.
It's not what it looked like.
He started to get jealous of every little thing or other guys when they're not even doing things that were inappropriate.
You're being ridiculous. It's Becky's new boyfriend, for crying out loud.
You don't disrespect me, you hear me?
Stop, you're hurting me.
You flirt with another guy, you'll find out about what hurt is.
I didn't. You wouldn't.
He was very jealous, and he was very domineering and controlling, and that didn't sit well with her.
Turns out, Janae's not the only one to have noticed Trevor's change in behavior.
So, what was up with Trevor the other night?
I don't know. He's been funny lately.
Yeah, that's a word for it.
When we got home, he was all in my face and yelling at me. I've never seen him like that before. He grabbed me by the arm and, shook me a little bit.
What? That is not okay.
No, he's just a really intense guy. That's all. I mean, it was fine. I'm fine. It was just a really bad day, that's all.
But no matter how many bad days Trevor seems to have, he always finds a way of reeling Janae back in.
Surprise! Hey, I know it's late. I just wanted to apologize for acting like such a jerk lately.
He tried many times to win me back. Just all those nice, sweet, words that he thought I wanted to hear that would work and that would get him back in my life.
Down for a drink? I think it's trivia night at the bar down the street. Come on, I know you want to go. For you.
Okay. You just go through something on real quick.
They broke up, but they got back together, as young people want to do. He sort of considered her his property, and that began their difficulties.
I've been wanting to go to trivia night. How'd you know?
I just figured we'd try something a little different.
What are you doing?
Who the hell is calling you sexy?
Why are you going through my emails? It was a joke. Andre showed a pic of a fat guy on roller skates on the subway.
Andre, huh? Okay, Andre's gonna get his ass kicked.
Okay, for the last time, Andre is gay.
I just started feeling like this has gotta end. I can't put up with this.
You know what? No. I'm sick of this. Get out.
What? No, I'm not leaving.
Get out. Get out!
I said, I'm not going anywhere.
Get out!
19-year-old Janae Aragosa is trying to break things off with boyfriend Trevor Frederick, but it's not easy.
I said, I'm not going anywhere. And there is nothing you can do about it.
He hit me, and I just remembered getting so mad, and I was like, I'm not putting up with this.
Fine. If you won't leave, I will.
I was like, if you're gonna do this once, you're gonna keep on doing this. You know, this has gotta end.
Janae doesn't want to believe the worst will happen, but she knows she has to do something to protect herself.
Respondent's name?
Trevor. Trevor Frederick.
She had tried to break up the relationship. And, you know, just the whole incident, there was lots of rage in it. So she applied for an order of protection.
All right, this will order him to stay away from your home and school, refrain from any communication with you, unless you have any exceptions.
No exceptions. I just want to be safe.
Having this order of protection, I thought things might change. It prevented him from being where I lived, at my school. He was not to be anywhere near there.
I remember to file this with the family court. Oh, and change your locks as soon as possible.
I have a locksmith coming already.
Also, you might want to give his photo and a copy of this report to your building's management. Make sure they don't let him on the premises, you know. Better be safe than sorry.
I appreciate it.
The problem with the law, the way it's structured is, you know, orders of protection don't really do much until they're violated. You're in harm's way. The only, you know, ironclad way to really protect yourself is to extract yourself from the situation as thoroughly as possible.
But despite filing the order of protection, Janae is reluctant to completely change her life.
I was afraid my family would be very upset and disappointed with me. I was afraid of losing out on school. I was afraid it could possibly get turned around on me.
So you're into fedoras now?
Brittany is totally gonna bring the fedora back. Jason Raz already has.
Oh my God.
What?
It was Trevor.
Where?
Let's just go. It was definitely Trevor. Come on.
It's a scary thing for someone who's being stalked because that piece of paper does not protect you. Say he violates it once, he may only do a couple of days in jail. You know, if she had the resources, maybe she could have moved and changed the phone number, all of those things, but all these things cost money.
I also was unaware of what kind of resources were out there because we didn't talk about domestic violence and shelters and things like we talk about today.
Hey Jay, want to make sure you got home safe. Give me a call when you get in. Love you.
Janae, answer this phone right now. You are not going to believe what just happened. Oh my gosh. Okay, call me. You'll love it, I promise.
Janae, I know you're there. Pick up, Janae. You're gonna pay for what you've done. You cannot hide from me. I hate you. I hate you. I hate you. I hate you. I'm gonna kill you.
It was terrible. He was singing in some scary voice that sounded like from the movie Scream. My reaction to that message was, you're gonna need this. So save it. At first I felt safer with the order of protection, but then as soon as I saw how quickly he violated it and was able to multiple times threaten me and stalk me, I didn't feel safe.
So that's it. And then we're talking to Trevor, right? Well, not exactly. He still calls, leaves threatening messages.
Can he do that?
No.
She could just go to the police and show them, he's been calling me and here's my order of protection. He's prohibited from doing that. I want him arrested.
I don't know. I'm just really trying not to think about it. I just want it all to be over.
I was afraid of a lot of things. The thought of running away and going into hiding, I couldn't imagine all the people I let down, and just I would fail school, and I wouldn't have a job, and everything that I would lose, even my whole future.
You need a new man.
No, I'm definitely not ready for that. Oh, come on, Janae. I might know the perfect place. You could meet the perfect guy. Okay. Okay. It'll be fun, I promise. Oh, God.
Still, Trevor is out there, lurking. And he refuses to let Janae move on with her life.
He was obsessed with me. I wouldn't even call it love. I would call it obsession. And it was just a warped, sick sense that in his mind he thought, if I can't have this girl, nobody else in the world can.
He was stalking her constantly, calling her phone, leaving her voicemails, and escalating the threats of violence.
Open this door, Janae. Janae, open the door. Janae, open the door. I know you're in there, Janae.
Just stop it!
Janae, open the door. Janae.
Stop it!
Janae.
He would try to break in my room. He would go out onto the fire escape and try to break in my window. I would lay in bed and I would hear the door moving and my heart would just drop because I would feel like, oh my God, what if that door opens?
Nearly a month after breaking up with Trevor Frederick, things are reaching a fever pitch for 19-year-old Janae Aragosa.
Janae, open the door. Janae, open the door. I know you're in there.
In a relationship, when one person wants to break up and they articulate that to the other person, and the other person's not listening, they just keep pursuing it. That could be a little bit scary. That's basically what stalking is. So she was in fear of her physical safety.
Janae. Janae, open the door.
Make me pretty, girl.
Stay still. You look so good as a blonde.
I was constantly in fear. Constantly like, what is gonna happen to me next?
Hey, Janae. Are you ready to call it a day?
I'd much rather be here working than at home worrying about Trevor. Oh, then don't work. Let's go out. Where?
Anywhere but Nacho Mama's. I think we can all agree that place is dead to us.
Let's go dancing.
Perfect.
Come on.
No, don't back out now. You need this more than any of us.
Okay.
Trevor was still stalking her, and he was a very jealous man. But, she liked to go out and have a good time, and, like any college student.
Are you okay? Do you need another drink or something?
Yeah.
Excuse me, can we get some more drinks? Can we get some shots? I think we need some shots.
Hey, can I buy you a drink?
There was a guy that started talking to me. He was Italian. His personality was like very friendly and open.
Yeah. Sure, that's great.
What's your name?
What?
Your name.
I'm Janae.
Yeah, I'm Anthony. Look, it's really loud in here. I can barely hear you. I'm gonna go out for a smoke. You wanna go?
I'm here with some friends. Girl, don't worry about me. Go, have some fun. Go, have fun.
You been here before?
No, but I go to school a few blocks from here, so I kind of know the area.
School, huh? That's cool. I dropped out of college a few years ago, but I definitely want to go back.
Anthony Madonna was a kid from Yonkers, like kids in their 20s, like Janae, would just like to go out and hang out and have a good time and party. He worked as like a handyman at Sarah Lawrence College.
It's just temporary. I got bigger plans than that.
How am I supposed to kiss you later with you smoking that thing?
So there's a later?
He was kind and giving. Funny, too. I was thinking that it's nice to meet a nice guy for once, and oh, he's possibly a guy that I could date.
But just when things are looking up for Janae, suddenly it all comes crashing back down.
What are you smiling about?
How did you get in here?
Oh, you don't know. I live here now.
He had actually rented a room in my building. That's almost unimaginable for somebody to be that crazy, that they could have that much power to do that. I really did not know what to do. I was at a loss. I feared for my life.
I'm calling 911.
Don't worry about it. I'm gonna catch you alone sooner or later, baby. Believe that.
He was kicked out by the manager. He went to a different employee and rented a room through that employee.
Weeks after 19-year-old Janae Aragosa filed an order of protection against her ex-boyfriend Trevor, he's now living in her building.
The fact that the building rented that room to him in the same building that she lived doesn't negate the order of protection. They could still enforce the order of protection, but minus her moving, which I don't know if she had the financial resources to do, there's really not a lot of ways you can protect yourself.
Hello? Hello?
It's you. Come in.
Hey, did I scare you?
No, I just wasn't expecting you till 9.
I got you this.
You're so sweet. Thanks. Can I get you anything?
No, I'm good.
She had only been seeing Anthony for about a week. They liked each other, liked each other's company. It was just the beginning of a potential relationship.
What were you listening to?
Nothing, just this rap I've been working on.
You're a rapper.
No. Well, Oh, not professionally, at least. It's just something we do for fun.
Let me listen. So which one is you?
I'm coming up. Now.
You're good.
So, I guess we should get going.
Yeah, sure.
Hey, do you mind if I leave this here? I came straight from work.
Absolutely, go for it.
Thanks.
He said he had taken the subway from Yonkers, which is kind of a long ride. So that's why he had stuff with him.
Thanks.
They went out to a pool hall on Amsterdam Avenue, shot pool for a while.
Listen, this is the last time.
Sorry.
Why you keep doing this? How many times have I told you? Stop it. Stop it. You are not listening. Listen. Stop calling me. What? I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Little jumpy.
Just on the phone with my ex. Look, she's kind of crazy. She won't stop bugging me.
He said he had just broken up a while ago with some girl. I did mention something about I have this crazy ex who stalks me.
You won't believe this, but I've got a crazy ex too.
No way.
I was dating this guy for a while, and he's got issues.
What do you mean?
I had to get a restraining order against him.
That's nuts.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm still working through some stuff. I'm sorry.
Don't worry. Look, you're safe with me. We'll take it slow, okay?
They hung out, and then he wound up staying a couple extra hours, so they must have really enjoyed each other's company.
It's getting late. I have an early class in the morning. We should probably get going.
Anthony needs to retrieve his bag from her place before saying goodnight.
There it is. Safe and sound.
Great, yeah.
Hey.
Hey.
Okay, but seriously, it's late. Do you mind if we pick this up another night?
Right, taking it slow. Sorry. Backpack. Okay, so I'll call you. Maybe we can get together next week.
We were just talking, and he was getting his stuff, and we were talking about meeting again.
They're having one of those concerts in the park. Wednesday, I think.
Yeah. That'd be great.
Yeah.
What are you doing with my girl, man?
Hey.
Put yourself in this guy's shoes. You're out on a date, everything's going great, you know, you just met this girl, and then bam, this violent maniac comes barging through the door.
Take it easy, dude. Look, we just
No,
met.
you know what? I know what's going on.
Get out, Trevor! Get out!
Shut up! I'll get to you. Don't nobody play me like that.
At that moment, like, my heart dropped, and I just saw ambulances and sirens in my mind. And I was like, I need to call 911.
Bro, we're just friends.
Don't bro me.
Anthony said calm down. We're just friends. We didn't do anything, you know. I'm leaving right now. And Trevor just flew into a rage, and I knew something bad was gonna happen.
Give me that!
Stop it! Just stop it!
I thought he punched me. That's what it felt like. It felt like someone punched me. I didn't see a knife in his hand.
What did you do, man? Janae, what did you do, man?
What you made me do to my girl?
But she's not doing good.
Look what you made me do to my girl.
She's stabbed in the neck, and she has a certain amount of paralysis because he had cut part of her spinal cord. And then he turned on Anthony.
The last thing I saw before I passed out was Trevor take a step in Anthony's direction.
After leaving 19-year-old Janae Aragosa for dead inside her living room, her ex-boyfriend Trevor is attacking her new man.
Shut up!
Trevor kept pressing him to that edge of that balcony, and that Trevor pushed him. No question in my mind that he was pushed.
In a very short span of time, you know, everything went horribly wrong in this kid's life. The last few minutes of his life must have been absolutely, filled with terror and panic.
Meanwhile, Janae slips in and out of consciousness as she clings to life.
Besides being gravely wounded, she was probably in shock, you know. I mean, she gets stabbed in the neck in an extremely violent incident with someone she knows. You can die from shock, too, besides, you know, if you don't get medical attention right away.
Thankfully, all of the commotion alerts Janae's neighbor, Susan.
Janae? Janae, oh my God, oh my God.
I said, get a towel over there and call 911, and she's like, yes, yes, and she was crying. And so when she did that, Trevor came back.
Can you hear me? Are you okay?
Her back is to him because she's facing me. And at that point, I thought he was just going to murder us both. I was like, okay, we're dead now.
Stay away from us.
Get out!
Hey, listen, I need to call 911, okay? Hey, look at me. Look at me. You need to go. You need to go now. Now, okay?
She said, sir, you seem to be upsetting her. We have the scene under control, and the police are on their way, so can you please just leave? And he's like, okay. So he left. I don't know why.
It's okay. It's okay. Yes, my friend, she's been stabbed.
She called 911, and the 2-4 precinct patrol units showed up on the scene.
Call the hospital. Victim is a young female. Stabbed to the neck, paralyzed. Blood pressure's crashing. She's lost a liter of blood.
You're gonna be fine. You're gonna be fine, Janae.
It was a big scene, and they're trying to put my story together, and they're trying to figure out where Anthony went because they can't find him. They don't know. So they don't know if I'm, like, imagining things.
But then, a figure in the distance makes the reality of the situation all too clear.
Oh my God, that's him. Okay, that's the man that attacked her right there.
Hey, Lewis, over there.
He was just standing there staring off in space, like, and nothing ever happened.
Sir, I need you to put your hands on that pole.
A unit from the 2-4 precinct stopped him, and he was placed under arrest.
You got any weapons on you?
No, sir.
You sure?
Yes.
Relax your arm.
They showed me Trevor, and they were like, "Is this the man who stabbed you?" And I said, "Yes, that's him." And then they arrested him.
Then, outside the apartment building, police make a devastating discovery.
At the bottom of the courtyard, 5 stories below, they found the victim's body. The medical examiner's conclusion was that the victim died of blunt force trauma to the head. He hit the ground 5 stories down, head first.
Janae remains unaware of this tragedy as she fights her own battle to survive.
I actually died. I actually died when I was stabbed by Trevor. So I go to the hospital, I'm paralyzed, and my parents are called. They're very upset, of course. And I keep asking them for a week straight, and I keep asking people in the hospital, what happened to Anthony?
Just as Janae begins to recover from her physical injuries, she's hit with heartbreaking news.
On the 7th day that I was there, some social worker came and she was like, "Janae, I need to speak to you. Anthony is no longer with us." And then the whole feeling of, oh my God, what did I do? You feel like you're the one that killed him, like it's your literal fault. I was suicidal over it. A year later, I tried to kill myself.
Janae knows her only solace will come from knowing Anthony's killer is put away for good.
You know, people always say that, like when you make an arrest, they say, oh, it's over. No, it's not over. Because the jury, before they vote, they're presented a lot of things that present doubt from the defense,
But when Janae herself takes jurors through the harrowing details of her attack, there's no doubt about Trevor Frederick's guilt. On April 11, 2005, Trevor Frederick is sentenced to 30 years for the attack on Janae Aragosa. He receives an additional 15 years for the murder of Anthony Mandato.
For what he did to a young man and an innocent young lady, he should never see his natural life again outside of bars. And the judge said he will make sure that he never does. They're not gonna let him out.
For Janae Aragosa, the road to recovery has been a long one.
The doctors were saying that I probably wouldn't walk again. My mom stopped everything. She left her job. She became my caretaker full-time. And she gave me some kind of belief that nobody else could. And that love and that energy is why I'm here today.
8 months after the attack, Janae is finally able to walk on her own again.
I have some challenges to work with. I have a disability. I have people who don't always understand that. I have trauma in my past that I deal with, and I can't always explain the whole traumatic story to everybody I just meet and say, well, that's why I feel this way. But I'm here and I'm happy. I have a job and I just graduated college, which I thought I might never do. So I'm really proud of that.
Ever since, she's worked tirelessly to combat domestic violence in hopes that she can stop at least one person from going through anything like her own ordeal.
I was afraid of everything that I would lose. And putting it in retrospect now, looking at it, those things, all those things, those are small in the scheme of things when you're compared to risking your life. And you really need to make action and choose to go into hiding if you need to go to the shelters to get help and report it. You may have to report it 5, 6, 7 times, but keep on reporting it because you need to. It's important.
There are crimes that remain unsolved because investigators run out of evidence. There are crimes that remain unsolved because witnesses disappear, memories fade, and years bury the truth beneath layers of silence. And then there are cases like Angie Dodge's, where the truth was sitting inside a laboratory freezer, waiting for science to become powerful enough to speak. On the morning of June 13, 1996, 18-year-old Angie Dodge was found dead inside her Idaho Falls apartment. She had been raped and stabbed. Her throat had been slashed. She was supposed to go to work that morning. She never arrived. Instead, someone found her body, and within hours the quiet horror inside one apartment became the center of a murder investigation that would consume families, divide a community, imprison an innocent young man, and remain haunted by one question. Who killed Angie Dodge? At first, investigators believed they had the answer. They did not. The apartment became a crime scene. Every object mattered. Every hair. Every biological trace. Every mark. Every fragment of information that could lead detectives toward the person who had entered Angie's home and ended her life. But the killer had left something behind. DNA. In 1996, DNA technology could tell investigators that biological material belonged to a particular genetic profile. What it could not easily do was tell them where that person lived, who his relatives were, or how to build an enormous family tree leading backward through generations. That limitation would become one of the central tragedies of the case. Because the DNA was there. The answer was there. But the technology needed to reach it did not yet exist. The investigation moved forward anyway. And eventually, police focused on Christopher Tapp, a young man who knew people within the same loose social circle as Angie. Tapp was 20 years old. He had no physical evidence connecting him to the murder. Most importantly, DNA evidence excluded him as the source of semen recovered from the crime scene. Yet investigators continued questioning him. Again. And again. And again. Over multiple sessions, the pressure intensified. Investigators confronted Tapp with accusations. They used deception. They threatened him with the possibility of severe punishment. They suggested scenarios. They pressed him to explain a crime he repeatedly denied committing. The interrogation did not produce the truth. Produced a confession. That confession would become the foundation of a prosecution that changed the lives of everyone involved. In 1998, Christopher Tapp was convicted of first-degree murder, rape, and use of a deadly weapon. He was sentenced to life in prison, plus additional time for the other offenses. An 18-year-old woman was dead. An innocent man was behind bars. And the real killer remained free. For years, the case appeared to be over. But Angie's mother, Carol Dodge, could not make herself believe the story was finished. At first, she had believed Tapp was responsible. Like many relatives of homicide victims, she wanted certainty. She wanted justice. She wanted the person responsible for her daughter's death to be punished. But years passed. And something began to trouble her. The DNA. The evidence did not fit. Tapp's confession contained details that did not consistently match the physical evidence. Investigators had obtained his statements, but the biological material from the crime scene told another story. A different man had left that DNA. A different man had raped Angie. A different man had killed her. The question was no longer simply whether Christopher Tapp was guilty. The question was whether everyone had been looking in the wrong direction from the beginning. In 2007, the Idaho Innocence Project took up Tapp's case. The search for the truth entered a new era. Evidence that had once seemed exhausted was examined again. Hairs recovered from the crime scene were subjected to mitochondrial DNA testing. The results were devastating to the original prosecution theory. Tapp was excluded. Again. The science continued to separate him from the crime. But that did not immediately free him. The legal system had already committed itself to the conviction. The confession existed. The verdict existed. The sentence existed. 20 years of prison time stood behind them like a wall. And beyond that wall was the unanswered question. Who was the unknown man? Investigators continued testing evidence. More DNA testing was performed. Evidence from Angie's clothing and other objects was examined. Tapp was excluded. Other potential suspects were excluded. The killer was still somewhere beyond the reach of the investigation. Then came one of the strangest turns in the case. Investigators began looking beyond traditional DNA matching. They looked at ancestry. They looked at genetic relationships. They examined the male lineage represented in the unknown DNA. The idea was revolutionary for a case that had been trapped in 1996. If the killer could not be identified directly, perhaps his relatives could lead investigators to him. The first major public breakthrough came in 2014, when investigators used a public DNA database in an attempt to trace the male lineage. The search produced a possible connection to the Usry family. For a moment, the case seemed to be moving toward another dramatic breakthrough. But science stopped it. Further testing excluded the Usry family. The lead collapsed. The killer remained unidentified. Yet something had changed. The investigators now knew that the DNA itself could potentially point toward the killer's family. That meant the case was no longer dependent entirely on eyewitnesses. It did not depend on someone suddenly remembering a license plate from 1996. It did not depend on a confession. It did not depend on a suspect walking into a police station. The evidence could speak through genetics. In 2017, investigators released a DNA phenotype image based on the unknown biological evidence. It was an attempt to visualize what the unidentified killer might have looked like. The image was striking. The case was suddenly back in the public eye. The face of an unknown man appeared in headlines. A killer who had escaped identification for more than 2 decades now had a reconstructed appearance. But a picture was not a name. And the name was what Angie's family needed. Meanwhile, Christopher Tapp had spent 20 years in prison. 20 years. 2 decades of birthdays missed. 2 decades of ordinary mornings he would never get back. 2 decades in which the real killer was free. In March 2017, Tapp was released after reaching an agreement with prosecutors. He had served approximately 20 years, but the first-degree murder conviction initially remained in place. It was an extraordinary moment. A man convicted of killing Angie Dodge was walking out of prison, while the actual killer was still unidentified. And Angie's mother was standing on the other side. Carol Dodge had become one of the people fighting for Tapp's freedom. The victim's mother was now publicly supporting the man who had once been accused of murdering her daughter. That alone revealed how completely the case had changed. But it was not over. Not remotely. The DNA remained. And the investigators kept following it. Then came the breakthrough that had seemed impossible in 1996. Investigators used forensic genetic genealogy. Instead of searching only for a direct match, investigators constructed a family tree from the unknown DNA profile. The work was painstaking. Distant relatives, genetic relationships, family branches, geographic connections, generations of people. The killer's identity began emerging from the branches. The name was Brian Drips. A man living in Idaho. A man who had been in the area at the time of Angie's murder. A man investigators now believed could be connected directly to the DNA left behind at the crime scene. And then came the detail that made the revelation even more chilling. Drips had lived across the street from Angie's apartment at the time of the murder. Across the street. For more than 20 years, the answer had been hiding in the same neighborhood where the crime occurred. Investigators obtained a DNA sample associated with Drips and compared it with the biological evidence preserved from the crime scene. The profiles matched. The unknown DNA finally had a name. The name finally had a face. And the face belonged to a man who had lived across the street from Angie Dodge. In May 2019, authorities announced that Brian Drips had been identified as the source of the DNA. The case that had begun in 1996 had finally found its missing link. But the revelation carried another shock. Christopher Tapp had been telling the truth. The DNA that investigators had possessed before his trial had already excluded him. The man who had spent decades behind bars was not Angie's killer. The real killer had been somewhere else. And science had finally found him. Drips was arrested and charged in connection with Angie's rape and murder. According to investigators, he confessed and told authorities that he had acted alone. The investigation that had once depended on interrogation had ultimately been solved by evidence that could not be threatened, manipulated, or persuaded. DNA. 23 years after Angie Dodge was killed, the genetic evidence finally identified the man responsible. But another courtroom battle remained. On July 17, 2019, a judge vacated Christopher Tapp's murder conviction and dismissed the charges against him based on actual innocence. The man who had entered prison as a young man walked out legally exonerated. 21 years of his life had disappeared. The courtroom contained an image almost impossible to comprehend. Christopher Tapp and Carol Dodge together. The innocent man. The mother of the murdered woman. Two people whose lives had been permanently connected by a crime neither of them committed. For Carol, the moment was complicated. Her daughter was still dead. Nothing could change that. No court ruling could restore Angie. No DNA test could return the years that had been stolen from Tapp. No confession could erase the suffering of two families. But finally, the truth was no longer buried. Angie had been murdered in the early morning hours of June 13, 1996. For years, the case seemed to have no answer. Then the investigation turned inward. The wrong man was accused. The wrong man was convicted. The wrong man lost 21 years. And the real killer remained free. Until the DNA caught up with him. That is what makes the Angie Dodge case so haunting. The killer did not disappear without leaving a trace. He left exactly what investigators needed. The evidence simply had to wait for the future. Technology changed. DNA science changed. Forensic genealogy changed what investigators believed was possible. And suddenly, a case that had survived more than 2 decades could be reopened through a genetic trail. The story became more than a murder investigation. It became a warning. A warning about false confessions. A warning about investigative tunnel vision. A warning about what can happen when a theory becomes more important than evidence. And above all, it became proof that a cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Sometimes evidence waits. Sometimes technology catches up. Sometimes the truth survives longer than the people trying to bury it. For Angie Dodge, the truth arrived 23 years late. For Christopher Tapp, freedom arrived after 21 years. For Carol Dodge, justice came with a wound that could never completely close. And for the community of Idaho Falls, the case left behind a question far darker than the simple identity of a killer. How could the man responsible have been so close? How could an innocent man have been imprisoned, while the real killer remained free? How many years of someone's life can disappear when a system becomes convinced it has already found the answer? Those questions remain attached to Angie's name. Because the most frightening part of this story is not that the killer left no evidence. He did. The frightening part is that the evidence was there from the beginning. It was preserved. It survived. It waded through decades of failed theories, courtroom battles, appeals, interrogations, prison years, technological advances, and family heartbreak. And eventually it spoke. Brian Drips. The name that investigators had been searching for since 1996. The name hidden inside a genetic trail. The name connected to a man who had lived across the street from the victim. The name that finally separated the real killer from the innocent man who had carried his crime for 21 years. The case began with an 18-year-old woman who did not come home. It ended with science revealing who had taken her life. But the silence surrounding Angie Dodge's death lasted for more than 2 decades. And in that silence another life was lost, not to murder but to a conviction. That is why the Angie Dodge case remains so powerful. Because it is not simply the story of a killer caught after 23 years. It is the story of evidence that refused to disappear. It is the story of a mother who eventually questioned the conviction she had once supported. It is the story of an innocent man who survived a system that had convinced itself he was guilty. And it is the story of a murderer who believed that time would protect him. For 23 years it did. Then DNA remembered. And when it finally spoke, it did not whisper. It named him. The DNA had finally spoken, but the story did not become easier to understand once the name Brian Drips entered the case. In some ways, that was when the deepest questions began. Because identifying a killer after more than 2 decades does not erase what happened during those years. It does not rewind the clock. It does not return a daughter to her mother. It does not return a young man to the life he should have lived outside prison walls. And it certainly does not erase the disturbing chain of decisions that allowed an 18-year-old murder investigation to become a decades-long nightmare. Angie Dodge was 18 years old when she was killed in Idaho Falls, Idaho, in June 1996. She was young. She had a job. She had friends. She had a mother who expected to see her again. Her life was ordinary in the most important sense. She was living the kind of life that millions of people live every day, surrounded by routines that feel permanent only because no one expects them to suddenly end. Then one morning everything changed. Inside her apartment, investigators encountered a crime scene that immediately suggested violence. Angie had been sexually assaulted. Her throat had been cut. Biological evidence was recovered. A DNA profile belonging to an unknown male was eventually developed from that evidence. That should have been the most important fact in the investigation. There was an unknown man. His genetic signature was sitting inside the evidence. He had left behind something that could potentially identify him. But in 1996, the science had limits. A DNA profile was not a magic photograph. It could tell investigators whether 2 biological samples came from the same person. It could exclude suspects. Could establish relationships. But if the unknown profile did not match anyone in the databases available at the time, investigators could still be left staring at a string of genetic markers with no name attached. That was the problem. The killer had left evidence. But he had not left his identity. And investigators needed a suspect. That pressure became increasingly important as the case developed. Christopher Tapp entered the investigation. He was young. He knew people connected to the broader circle surrounding Angie. He became a focus of questioning. What followed would become one of the most controversial elements of the entire case. Tapp denied killing Angie. He denied raping her. But investigators continued to question him. The interrogation session stretched on. The pressure increased. And eventually, Tapp began providing statements that prosecutors would use against him. The investigation had reached a critical psychological point. Once investigators believed they had found the person responsible, every new piece of information could be interpreted through that theory. A confession could be treated as confirmation. A contradiction could be explained away. Missing physical evidence could become less important. The unknown DNA could be treated as something that needed an explanation, rather than as evidence pointing toward another person. And that is where the tragedy deepened. Because DNA testing did not identify Tapp as the source of the biological material connected to the sexual assault. The evidence excluded him. Yet the prosecution moved forward. In 1998, Tapp was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Imagine the moment. A young man hearing a judge announce that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Imagine the prison doors closing. Imagine the years beginning to stack one on top of another. 1 year. 5 years. 10. 15. 20. Outside the prison, the world continued changing. Phones became smaller. Computers became faster. The internet transformed everyday life. New generations were born. People who had been children in 1996 became adults. People who had been teenagers became parents. Technology that did not exist when Angie was killed became routine. And inside the evidence storage system, the biological material remained. Frozen in time. Waiting. The case itself never completely disappeared. Angie's family continued living with the absence. Her mother, Carol Dodge, carried the loss through birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, and ordinary days when the realization returned that Angie would never walk through the door again. At first, Tapp's conviction appeared to offer an answer. But an answer is not necessarily the truth. Over time, questions about the case became harder to ignore. The DNA evidence was one of those questions. If Tapp was the killer, why did the biological evidence not match him? If his confession was accurate, why did parts of the physical evidence point elsewhere? And if another man's DNA was present, who was that man? The question became impossible to bury. Eventually, the Idaho Innocence Project became involved. The case was re-examined. The evidence was re-examined. The interrogation was re-examined. And slowly, the story that had seemed settled began to break apart. Testing of additional evidence provided further support for Tapp's innocence. The science was moving in a direction the original investigation had not anticipated. Tapp had spent years imprisoned under a conviction that was increasingly difficult to reconcile with the biological evidence. Then, in 2017, after roughly 2 decades behind bars, he was released. But release was not the same thing as exoneration. That distinction mattered. A man could walk out of prison while still carrying the legal shadow of a murder conviction. He could be free physically while still being officially labeled a killer. Tapp wanted more. His supporters wanted more. And eventually the courts would provide it. But before that happened, another extraordinary relationship had developed. Carol Dodge began to believe that Christopher Tapp had not killed her daughter. The mother of a murdered 18-year-old was now helping support the case of the man who had been convicted of her murder. It was difficult to imagine a more complicated emotional reversal. For years, Carol had lived with the belief that the person responsible for Angie's death had been identified. Now she was confronting the possibility that the man she had once associated with her daughter's murder had himself been wronged. And that meant the real killer was still free. Somewhere. Possibly nearby. Possibly living an ordinary life. Possibly watching the case from a distance. Possibly believing that the passage of time had erased the danger. That possibility became even more frightening as the investigation moved toward a new kind of forensic science. Forensic genetic genealogy. The technique was changing cold case investigations across the United States. Instead of requiring an exact DNA match to a known suspect, investigators could sometimes use genetic information to identify relatives of an unknown person. Those relatives could then form branches of a family tree. Investigators could work backward and sideways through generations, narrowing the possibilities until the unknown individual could potentially be identified. It was a completely different way of thinking about DNA. The old question was simple. Who matches this profile? The new question was far more powerful. Who is related to the person who left this profile? That distinction transformed the investigation. In the Angie Dodge case, investigators began searching for the family behind the unknown DNA. The first major attempt produced a lead connected to the Usry family. The name became part of the investigation. For a moment, investigators appeared to be approaching the answer. But genetic testing ultimately excluded the family. The lead collapsed. The case remained open. And that failure was important, because it demonstrated both the power and the limitations of the new technology. Genetic genealogy could generate possibilities. It could reveal relationships. But investigators still had to verify those possibilities through traditional forensic work. A family connection was not a conviction. A resemblance was not proof. A database hit was not the end. Every lead had to survive scientific scrutiny. So the search continued. Then investigators turned to another possibility. Could they predict physical characteristics from the DNA? Could the genetic evidence provide a rough image of the unknown man? The result was a DNA phenotype image. A face emerged from the science. Not a photograph. Not a perfect reconstruction. A statistical estimate of appearance. But for a case that had spent more than 20 years without a face, even an estimate mattered. The public saw the image. Investigators hoped someone would recognize it. Maybe a former neighbor. Maybe an old friend. Maybe someone who had known a man in Idaho Falls in 1996. Maybe someone who had heard a strange confession years earlier and never understood its significance. The image became another attempt to force the mystery into the open. But the killer still had not been named. And behind the investigation stood one undeniable fact. He had been free for more than 2 decades. Then, slowly, investigators began narrowing the genetic family tree. The search moved through relatives. Branches were eliminated. Others remained. Geographic information became important. So did the historical circumstances. Who had lived in the area? Who had been present? Who could have had access to Angie? Who fit the genetic relationship? The possibilities became fewer. And one name began standing apart. Brian Drips. Drips had lived in Idaho Falls around the time Angie was murdered. More strikingly, he had lived across the street from Angie. The geography was almost impossible to ignore. For more than 20 years, the investigation had searched for an unknown man. Now investigators had a candidate who was not some distant stranger from another state. He had been right there. Across the street. The revelation changed the emotional temperature of the case. The unknown killer suddenly had a location. He had a neighborhood. He had a history. He had a name. But investigators still needed proof. DNA genealogy had pointed toward him. That was not enough. They needed a direct comparison. So investigators obtained a DNA sample associated with Drips. The sample was compared with the biological evidence preserved from Angie's murder. And then the case reached the moment everyone had been waiting for. The DNA matched. After 23 years, the unknown male profile had finally been connected to Brian Drips. The man investigators had been searching for was no longer unknown. The biological evidence that had existed since the beginning had finally acquired a name. And suddenly, every year of the investigation looked different. 1996 looked different. 1998 looked different. The years Christopher Tapp spent in prison looked different. The decades of uncertainty looked different. Because the case now had an answer that had been available in genetic form all along. The killer had left his signature. The investigation simply had not yet possessed the tools necessary to read it. Drips was arrested in 2019. Authorities announced that the DNA evidence connected him to the crime. The case that had once seemed destined to remain unresolved had been transformed. But then came another question. Why? Why had Drips done it? What had happened inside Angie's apartment that night? What had motivated the attack? What had he believed would happen afterward? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how had he managed to continue living for decades with the knowledge of what he had done? Those questions had no simple answers. Even after an arrest, some mysteries remain locked inside a person's mind. But one thing was now clear. Christopher Tapp was not the man whose DNA had been left at the crime scene. The biological evidence had identified another person. The legal system now had the task of correcting a conviction that should never have happened. For Tapp, that correction was not merely symbolic. It was his life. 21 years. Years that could not be returned. Years that could not be compensated by a single courtroom announcement. Years that had been spent behind bars because investigators had believed a confession more strongly than the physical evidence that contradicted it. The Angie Dodge case had therefore become something larger than a cold case. It became a story about how investigations can fail, how certainty can become dangerous, how a confession can overpower contradictory evidence, and how technology can sometimes expose mistakes that humans were unable to see. The case also demonstrated something else. Time does not necessarily destroy evidence. Sometimes time strengthens it. Every year that passed brought new scientific techniques, new databases, new computational tools, new methods of interpreting genetic relationships. The evidence recovered in 1996 had not changed. The world around it had. And eventually, the world became capable of understanding what that evidence had been saying. Angie Dodge's killer had been hiding in the silence between generations. The family tree had become the map. The DNA had become the compass. And the unknown man had become Brian Drips. But for Angie's mother, the arrest could never be the ending people imagined. There was no moment when everything suddenly became normal. There was no morning when the grief disappeared. There was no explanation capable of restoring the 18-year-old daughter who had been taken from her. Justice could identify a killer, could free an innocent man, could correct a record. But it could not reverse death. That is the cruelest truth in every homicide investigation. The victim never gets the second chance. The victim never sees the suspect arrested. The victim never hears the courtroom verdict. The victim never watches the evidence finally speak. Angie was 18. She should have had decades ahead of her. Instead, her life ended inside an apartment in Idaho Falls, and her name became attached to one of the most extraordinary forensic investigations in American criminal history. For years, the case seemed to say that the killer had won. He had disappeared. The wrong man had gone to prison. The investigation had stalled. The public moved on. But the evidence did not. It waited. And eventually the science caught up. The story of Angie Dodge is therefore not only about how a murderer was finally identified. It is about how a crime can remain alive inside evidence long after the headlines disappear. A hair. A biological sample. A genetic profile. A microscopic trace. Something that looks meaningless to an ordinary person can become decisive decades later. And somewhere inside that evidence was the answer. The killer had never truly vanished. He had simply become invisible to the technology of his time. Until one day he wasn't. And when investigators finally looked through the right lens, the mystery that had haunted Idaho Falls for decades began collapsing around a single name. Brian Drips. The man across the street. The man whose DNA connected him to the crime. The man who could no longer hide behind the passage of time. And behind that name stood the life of Angie Dodge, frozen forever at 18 years old. The investigation had finally reached the truth. But the truth had arrived carrying a terrible price. 23 years of waiting. 21 years of wrongful imprisonment. A mother forced to grieve and then question the very conviction she had once accepted. And an innocent man forced to rebuild a life that had been taken from him almost as completely as Angie's had been. The case was solved. But nothing about it was simple. Because sometimes catching the killer is only the moment when the world finally understands how much damage the crime has already caused. The arrest of Brian Dripps did not erase the years that came before it. If anything, it forced everyone connected to the case to look backward, to examine every decision, every assumption, every piece of evidence that had once seemed to point toward Christopher Tapp. For the first time, investigators could look at the entire story with the identity of the real killer known, and that perspective made the original investigation appear painfully different. In 1996, there had been an unknown man inside Angie Dodge's apartment. There had been biological evidence. There had been a crime scene. There had been a young woman whose life had been violently taken. And there had been a police investigation desperate for an answer. But desperation can be dangerous. When a murder shocks a community, people want a name. They want an arrest. They want to believe that the person responsible has been found, and that the danger has been removed. The longer a case remains unresolved, the greater that pressure can become. For Angie's family, the pressure was unbearable. Her mother wanted justice. The community wanted justice. Investigators wanted justice. And Christopher Tapp eventually became the person placed at the center of that demand. The interrogation that followed would later become a defining part of the case. Tapp was repeatedly questioned. Investigators confronted him with allegations and pushed him toward admitting involvement. He initially denied responsibility, but over time his statements changed. Eventually, he provided a confession. To investigators at the time, the confession appeared to solve the mystery. But a confession is only as reliable as the circumstances surrounding it. And the physical evidence had never stopped pointing toward another man. The unknown DNA profile remained. That fact would become impossible to ignore as years passed. Tapp's supporters argued that his confession had been coerced, and that the inconsistencies between his statements and the physical evidence demonstrated that he had not committed the crime. The case began moving in an entirely different direction. Instead of asking how to prove Tapp was guilty, attorneys and investigators began asking a far more important question. What if he was innocent? That question changed everything. Because if Tapp was innocent, then the DNA belonged to the real killer. And if the DNA belonged to the real killer, then the person responsible for Angie's murder had been walking free for years. The possibility was terrifying. It meant the original investigation had not simply failed to close the case. It had potentially sent the wrong person to prison while leaving the real offender outside. The passage of time made the injustice harder to comprehend. Tapp had been 20 years old when Angie was murdered. He was still a young man when the state took away his freedom. By the time he was released, the world he had known in 1996 had almost completely disappeared. The technology had changed. The city had changed. People had changed. But the prison years could not be recovered. Then came the testing that would help dismantle the original case. Hair evidence recovered during the investigation was examined using mitochondrial DNA testing. The results excluded Tapp. The significance was enormous. Another piece of physical evidence was telling investigators the same thing. Not him. Not Christopher Tapp. Not the man who had spent years behind bars. The evidence was directing attention toward someone else. And that someone else still had no name. The unknown male profile became the central character in the investigation. No photograph. No confession. No fingerprints leading directly to an identified suspect. Just DNA. A genetic signature waiting for a breakthrough. In the early years of the investigation, that might have seemed like an impossible dead end. But forensic science was changing. Across the country, investigators were beginning to understand that genetic information could reveal far more than a simple identity match. DNA could expose relationships. It could connect distant relatives. It could reveal family lines that cross generations. The rise of public genealogy databases created a new investigative possibility. A person might never have submitted their own DNA to a database. But perhaps a cousin had. Perhaps a distant relative had. Perhaps someone several branches away had uploaded genetic information to explore their ancestry. And if enough relatives appeared, investigators could construct a family tree. That family tree could lead toward the unknown suspect. The technique was controversial in some respects, powerful in others, and completely transformative for cold case investigations. In Angie Dodge's case, investigators began exploring that possibility. The search did not immediately succeed. One family appeared promising. Further testing showed otherwise. The lead involving the Usry family collapsed. For many investigators, that might have been devastating. But the technology had accomplished something important. It had demonstrated that the unknown DNA profile could potentially be traced through relatives. The door had opened. It simply had not yet revealed the person standing behind it. Investigators kept searching. And eventually, the genetic trail led toward another family. The name Brian Dripps emerged. Dripps was not an obvious suspect from the original investigation. He had not been the person investigators had spent years questioning. He had not been convicted. He had not been the face of the case. He had existed outside the spotlight. But the genetic evidence was pointing toward him. Then investigators examined his connection to the location. Dripps had lived in Idaho Falls around the time Angie was killed. And he had lived across the street from her. That detail was chilling. The investigation had spent years looking outward. The answer had been close. Almost unimaginably close. Across the street. The discovery did not automatically establish guilt. Investigators still needed direct forensic confirmation. So they obtained a DNA sample associated with Dripps. The comparison was performed. The result was decisive. The genetic material matched the unknown male profile recovered from the crime scene. After more than 2 decades, the unknown man finally had a name. Brian Dripps. The case that had begun with a young woman found murdered in her apartment had reached a breakthrough through a technology that did not exist when she died. And suddenly, the biological evidence that had once been incapable of naming the killer had become the strongest witness in the investigation. Dripps was arrested in 2019. Authorities announced that he had been identified through forensic genetic genealogy and subsequent DNA testing. The arrest immediately changed the story surrounding Christopher Tapp. For years, Tapp had been the person whose name appeared alongside Angie's murder. Now the evidence pointed elsewhere. The man who had spent 20 years in prison had not been the source of the DNA. The real killer had been identified. The consequences for Tapp were profound. In July 2019, his murder conviction was vacated and the case against him was dismissed. The legal system had finally acknowledged what the DNA had been indicating for years. Christopher Tapp was innocent. But innocence after 20 years is not the same as innocence before 20 years are taken away. That distinction cannot be measured by a courtroom document. It cannot be calculated in dollars. It cannot be repaired by a single apology. A person who loses decades loses experiences that can never be recreated. Tapp had missed ordinary life. Family moments. Relationships. Freedom. Time. The small things that people rarely notice until they are gone. And while Tapp was imprisoned, Angie's mother had continued living with the murder of her daughter. The two tragedies became inseparable. One woman had lost her life. One man had lost his freedom. Both losses came from the same crime. And both were connected to the same failure to identify the true offender. When Brian Dripps was finally brought into the legal process, the story reached another stage. Investigators could now ask him questions that had remained impossible for 23 years. What happened that night? Why Angie? What happened inside the apartment? What had he done after leaving? And how had he lived with the secret? Authorities reported that Dripps confessed to the killing. He ultimately pleaded guilty to charges related to Angie's murder and sexual assault, and received a prison sentence. The confession mattered. But by then, the most important evidence had already spoken. The DNA had connected him to the crime. The genetic genealogy had led investigators toward him. The direct comparison had confirmed the connection. The confession came after the science had pointed to the truth. That distinction was crucial. The case had begun with a confession from the wrong man. It ended with scientific evidence identifying the right one. The contrast was almost impossible to miss. In the first investigation, investigators had pressed a suspect until he gave them a story they could use. In the final investigation, investigators followed evidence until it led them to a suspect. Two approaches. Two men. Two completely different outcomes. And one victim at the center of both. Angie Dodge. The young woman whose murder had remained unresolved for more than 2 decades. The case became one of the most widely discussed examples of the potential of forensic genetic genealogy, but it also became a warning about the consequences of investigative tunnel vision. The lesson was not that technology always gets the answer. It was that evidence must remain more important than the theory built around it. Theory can be wrong. A confession can be false. A suspect can look convincing. Community can believe. A courtroom can convict. And yet the biological evidence can still be saying something entirely different. The Angie Dodge investigation demonstrated the danger of ignoring that voice. For years, the case appeared to have an ending. Christopher Tapp had been convicted. The killer was supposedly behind bars. The community could move forward. But the real ending was still waiting. It was waiting inside the DNA. And it waited until investigators had the tools to understand it. That is what makes the case so haunting. The killer did not escape because he left no trace. He escaped because the trace could not yet be transformed into a name. Time protected him. Technology eventually exposed him. And the same evidence that helped free an innocent man helped identify the person responsible for Angie's death. The chain was finally complete. Angie Dodge. The unknown DNA. The wrongfully convicted man. The genetic family tree. The man across the street. Brian Dripps. One case. One biological signature. Decades of consequences. But for everyone involved, there was still one reality that no verdict could change. Angie was 18 years old when her life ended. She never saw the scientific breakthrough. She never saw Christopher Tapp walk free. She never heard investigators announce Brian Dripps's name. She never knew that the evidence recovered from her body would eventually become the key to solving the crime. Her life had ended in 1996. Her case continued for decades. And the final answer arrived in a world she would never know. That is the cruel rhythm of a cold case. The victim remains forever trapped in the moment when everything stopped. Everyone else grows older. Investigators retire.
Witnesses die.
Neighborhoods change. Buildings disappear. Technology advances. Families grow. Children become adults. And somewhere inside a box or a laboratory freezer, a piece of evidence remains exactly where it was left. Waiting. Waiting for someone to ask the right question. Waiting for someone to challenge the old answer. Waiting for science to become capable of revealing what human investigation had missed. In Angie Dodge's case, that evidence survived long enough to do exactly that. And when it finally spoke, it did more than identify a killer. It exposed an injustice. It changed the official history of the case. Cleared an innocent man. And it proved that the truth had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting in silence. The silence had finally been broken, but silence had not been the only thing surrounding Angie Dodge's case. There had also been doubt. Doubt about the confession. Doubt about the investigation. Doubt about how an 18-year-old woman could be murdered in her own apartment, how biological evidence could remain available for decades, and how the person whose DNA was recovered could remain unidentified, while another young man lost the prime years of his life behind prison walls. The name Christopher Tapp had once been spoken as though it were the final answer. Then science changed the question. That transformation did not happen overnight. It happened slowly, painfully, through years of legal challenges and renewed testing, through attorneys who refused to accept that a confession should outweigh biological evidence, through investigators who were willing to reopen assumptions that had become deeply embedded in the case. And at the center of everything was a simple fact. Someone else had left DNA behind. That fact had existed before the conviction. It existed during the conviction. It existed while Tapp was in prison. It existed while his family fought for him. It existed while Angie's mother struggled to understand what had happened to her daughter. And it remained there after Tapp walked free. The evidence did not change. The interpretation did. That distinction is one of the darkest lessons of the Angie Dodge case. A murder investigation is supposed to move from evidence toward a suspect. But when investigators become convinced they already know the suspect, evidence can begin moving in the opposite direction. Instead of asking what the evidence proves, investigators may begin asking how the evidence can be made to fit the theory they already believe. In Tapp's case, the confession became powerful. A confession feels definitive. Sounds like certainty. It gives investigators something they can write into a report, prosecutors something they can present in court, and a frightened community something it can believe. But a confession can be wrong. People can confess to crimes they did not commit. They can become confused. They can be pressured. They can adopt information provided during interrogation. And when a confession contains inconsistencies, those inconsistencies matter. Especially when science points in another direction. The biological evidence did not say that Tapp was the killer. It said something else. The unknown male profile belonged to someone. That person had been physically connected to the crime. And that person had disappeared into the population. For years, there was no obvious way to find him. Then technology began transforming the meaning of DNA. The development of forensic genetic genealogy created a new path through the darkness. Traditional forensic DNA searches depend heavily on databases containing profiles from known individuals. If the unknown sample matches someone in the database, investigators may have their suspect. But what happens when nobody matches? What happens when the killer has never submitted DNA? What happens when the person has no criminal record that places his genetic profile in a searchable system? The old investigation could stall. The new science could keep going. A distant relative might be enough. One genetic connection could lead to another. A cousin could lead to an uncle. An uncle could lead to a parent. A family branch could lead investigators toward a geographical area. And eventually, the unknown killer could emerge from a tree of relationships that existed long before the murder itself. That was the path investigators followed. The earlier attempt involving the Usry family had demonstrated how difficult the process could be. A promising genetic connection did not guarantee that investigators had found the correct family. The science required patience. Every possibility had to be tested. But investigators continued. And eventually, the search pointed toward Brian Drips. The name did not arrive alone. Came with geography, history, genetics, context. Drips had lived in Idaho Falls during the period surrounding Angie's murder. And he had lived across the street from her apartment. That single detail changed the atmosphere around the investigation. Imagine looking at an old map of the neighborhood. The streets are still there. The buildings may have changed. People have moved away. Decades have passed. But the distance between two locations remains. Across the street. That was where the suspected killer had lived. Not miles away. Not in another state. Not in some distant city. Across the street. For investigators, the genetic connection and geographic connection created a powerful lead. But a lead is not a conviction. There had already been one devastating mistake in this case. Investigators could not afford another. The next step had to be scientific. A DNA sample associated with Drips was obtained. It was compared with the biological evidence recovered from Angie's murder. The result connected Drips to the crime. After more than 20 years, the unknown male DNA profile finally had an identity. The case was no longer a mystery without a name. It had a suspect. And the suspect was someone who had been living in the same community where Angie had died. The revelation was staggering. For decades, people had imagined the killer as a shadowy stranger. A man who appeared, committed the crime, and vanished. But the reality was far more unsettling. The person connected to the evidence had been part of the same physical world. The same city. The same streets. The same years. The same community. And that realization forces a different question. How many times had people walked past him? How many ordinary days had passed while he carried the secret? How many times had Angie's name appeared in the news? How many anniversaries had come and gone? How many times had he watched investigators search for the wrong man? There is no easy answer. And perhaps that is what makes a cold case so psychologically disturbing. The passage of time can create the illusion that danger has disappeared. But time does not change what happened. It only creates distance between the crime and the moment of accountability. In 2019, that distance finally collapsed. Brian Drips was arrested. For the first time since 1996, investigators had identified the man whose DNA had been associated with the crime. And for the first time, Christopher Tapp's name could begin to separate itself from the murder. The legal consequences followed. Tapp's conviction was vacated. The charges were dismissed. The man who had spent approximately 20 years in prison was officially cleared. But freedom arrived with scars. Tapp had entered prison as a young man. He emerged decades older. The world had changed while he was gone. Technology had changed. Society had changed. People he once knew had grown older. Some had disappeared from his life entirely. And the person he had been before the conviction could never be completely recovered. That is the hidden cost of wrongful conviction. People often imagine exoneration as a finish line. A courtroom opens. A judge announces that the conviction is vacated. A man walks outside. Cameras flash. Family members embrace. And the story appears to end. But there is no reset button. The years remain. The memories remain. The habits formed in prison remain. The relationships that were lost remain lost. The opportunities that disappeared do not return. And the psychological weight of knowing that the system once declared you a murderer can survive long after the declaration is erased. For Tapp, the Angie Dodge case had taken 20 years. For Angie's family, it had taken even longer. And for Carol Dodge, the revelation that Tapp was innocent created an emotional conflict that few people could understand. She had spent years believing that her daughter's killer had been found. Then she discovered that the man convicted of killing Angie had himself been wronged. The search for justice had become inseparable from the search for truth. And truth required admitting that the original answer had been wrong. That admission is difficult in any investigation. It is even harder when a person has already been convicted. Because acknowledging a mistake means confronting everything that happened afterward. The interrogation. The trial. The sentence. The prison years. The years when the real killer remained free. Every part of the case had to be viewed again. And that is what made the Angie Dodge investigation more than a story about DNA. It became a story about institutional memory. Once a case enters the public consciousness, the first theory can become difficult to dislodge. Headlines establish narratives. Court records preserve them. People remember names. Families remember accusations. Communities remember arrests. But DNA does not care about the narrative. It does not care what investigators believed 20 years earlier. It does not care what a confession sounded like. It does not care what the public expected. It only reveals what the biological evidence can support. And in Angie Dodge's case, that evidence pointed away from Christopher Tapp toward another man, Brian Drips, the man whose identity had been hidden for decades inside a genetic profile. The arrest was therefore not simply the conclusion of a murder investigation. It was the reversal of a story that had shaped lives for more than 20 years. One man was finally identified. Another man was finally cleared. A mother finally knew that the person convicted of killing her daughter was not the person responsible. And Angie's name could finally be attached to the truth rather than to an unanswered question. Yet even after the arrest, the case retained its darkest element. The DNA had been there from the beginning. That means the possibility of solving the crime had never completely disappeared. The evidence had survived. The science had simply needed time to catch up. This is why cold cases can be so deceptive. They appear dead. The detectives leave. The files become old. The photographs fade. The witnesses age. The public forgets. But evidence does not necessarily forget. A microscopic biological trace can outlive an investigation. A fingerprint can remain. A piece of clothing can remain. A digital record can remain. A genetic profile can remain. And decades later, the smallest fragment can become the largest clue in the case. Angie Dodge's case demonstrated that reality with extraordinary force. The investigation had once been driven by a confession. It ultimately turned on DNA. The original suspect had been found through interrogation. The real suspect was found through genetics. The first conviction created certainty. The later evidence destroyed it. And the same case that once represented a failure of justice eventually became an example of how modern forensic science can correct an old mistake. But there was still one person at the center of it all who could never benefit from the correction. Angie. 18 years old. A daughter. A friend. A young woman with a future that existed only in possibilities. Every year after her death represented a life she never got to live. 23 years passed before the person responsible was identified. 23 years during which Angie remained 18 forever. That is the strange cruelty of time. Everyone around her grew older. Her mother aged. Investigators aged. Christopher Tapp aged. The killer aged. Technology advanced. The world changed. But Angie remained exactly where the story had left her. 18 years old. And that is where the emotional weight of the case ultimately rests. Not with the laboratory. Not with the database. Not with the courtroom. Not even with the arrest. It rests with the image of a young woman whose life was reduced to a crime scene photograph, a case file, a DNA profile, and a name in headlines. The investigation could identify the person responsible. It could correct the conviction. Could expose the mistake. But it could never give Angie back her future. That is why the case remains haunting. Because solving a murder does not undo the murder. It only tells the world what happened. And sometimes that truth takes decades to arrive. For Angie Dodge, it arrived long after the neighborhood had changed, long after the original investigators had moved on, and long after the man wrongly convicted had lost years that could never be returned. The truth arrived through a biological trace. Through relatives he had never expected to be connected to him. Through a family tree. Through modern science. And finally through a name. Brian Drips. A name that had been absent from the original headlines. A name that emerged decades later. A name that transformed the entire case. But even then, one final truth remained. The killer had not defeated the evidence. He had only outlasted the technology. And eventually technology caught up. The story did not end when Brian Drips was identified. A name on a case file could not erase the years of uncertainty. An arrest could not erase what happened inside Angie Dodge's apartment. And a courtroom could not restore the life that had been taken in 1996. What the arrest did was something more complicated. It forced the case to be seen without the fog of the original investigation, the false confession, the conviction, the years of imprisonment, the unanswered DNA, the genetic genealogy. The discovery that the man investigators had been searching for had been living across the street from Angie. All of it now formed one continuous chain, and at the center of that chain was a question that had become impossible to avoid. How had the investigation gone so wrong in the first place? In the first days after Angie's murder, investigators were facing an enormous crime scene and enormous public pressure. An 18-year-old woman had been killed in her own apartment. Her family needed answers. The community needed reassurance. Detectives needed a suspect. Every hour mattered. Every interview mattered. Every rumor could potentially become a lead. But a murder investigation is not simply a race to identify someone. It is a race to establish what the evidence can actually prove. The difference between those two goals can determine whether justice is done, or whether an innocent person becomes trapped inside someone else's crime. Christopher Tapp became trapped. The young man had not left the DNA profile recovered from Angie's case. Yet investigators continued to question him. The sessions became increasingly intense. Tapp was confronted with accusations. He was told what investigators believed had happened. He was pressured to provide information. And eventually, after prolonged questioning, his statements began to change. What investigators heard sounded like an admission. What prosecutors later presented as a confession would become one of the central pieces of the case against him. But there was something that confession could never change. DNA. The biological evidence did not suddenly become compatible with Tapp because he had confessed. It remained what it was. Evidence from the crime scene pointed toward an unidentified male. And that unidentified male was not Christopher Tapp. The contradiction should have been enormous. Instead, the investigation continued toward conviction. That decision would echo for decades. When Tapp was sentenced to life in prison, the real killer was still free. Somewhere beyond the walls of the courtroom, somewhere outside the prison system, the man whose DNA had been left at the scene was living his life. He could wake up every morning. He could drive through Idaho Falls. He could see the same streets. He could watch the years pass. Christopher Tapp could not. For Tapp, time became measured differently. A birthday inside prison. Another holiday. Another year. Another legal motion. Another attempt to convince someone that the evidence did not make sense. Outside, Angie's mother continued to carry the grief of losing her daughter. Two families were trapped inside the same case, but in completely different ways. One family had lost a daughter. Another family had lost a son to a conviction. And neither loss could be separated from the same investigative failure. The years continued. Then the science began changing. DNA analysis became more sophisticated. Laboratories developed new methods. Genetic databases grew. Researchers learned more about how distant relatives could reveal connections between people who had never met. Suddenly, A DNA profile that had once been a dead end could become the beginning of a family tree. The idea was extraordinary. The killer did not need to be in a criminal database. His brother could be there. His cousin. A distant relative. Someone who had uploaded genetic information for an entirely different reason. A genealogy hobby. An ancestry search. Curiosity about family history. The person who committed the murder might never have imagined that a relative's DNA could eventually lead investigators toward him. But that was the world changing around the Angie Dodge case. Investigators could now ask a question that had not been practical in 1996. Who is related to the unknown man? The first efforts produced leads but not the killer. One family was investigated and ultimately excluded. That failure could have ended the effort. Instead, it demonstrated the potential of the method. The genetic trail could be followed. It simply required the right branch. The investigation continued deeper into the unknown family. And eventually, the name Brian Drips appeared. The discovery was remarkable not simply because of the genetic connection. It was remarkable because of where Drips had lived. Across the street. The phrase sounds almost too perfect for a crime story. Across the street. A man connected to the DNA. A man who had lived near Angie at the time of her murder. A man who had somehow remained outside the original focus of the investigation. For more than 20 years, the killer had been a faceless genetic profile. Now investigators had a person whose history could be examined. But they did not stop with genealogy. They needed confirmation. That was essential. The original investigation had already demonstrated what happens when assumptions become stronger than evidence. This time the evidence had to lead. Investigators obtained a DNA sample connected to Drips. The laboratory comparison was performed. And the unknown male profile from Angie's case matched Drips. The mystery had crossed a line. The unidentified DNA was no longer unidentified. It belonged to a living man. Brian Drips. After years of searching, the investigation finally had a name. But the name brought another revelation. Christopher Tapp had not simply been a man whose conviction was questionable. He had been convicted while the actual source of the crime scene DNA remained free. The implications were enormous. Tapp's confession could no longer be viewed in isolation. It had to be considered against the biological evidence. The interrogation had to be reconsidered. The trial had to be reconsidered. The conviction had to be reconsidered. And eventually, the legal system did reconsider it. Tapp's murder conviction was vacated. The charges against him were dismissed. He was legally cleared. The moment should have been triumphant. But there was nothing triumphant about 20 years disappearing. There was relief. There was anger. There was grief. There was disbelief. There was the strange reality of standing outside prison after so much time and discovering that freedom itself had become unfamiliar. The world had moved on without him. But perhaps the most painful part was knowing that the years could never be returned. Court could say innocent. A court could correct the record. A court could dismiss the conviction. But no court could give Tapp back the life he should have lived. At the same time, Angie's family was confronting another kind of truth. For years, they had been told that the person responsible for Angie's murder had been found. Now they knew that was wrong. The man they had associated with the crime was innocent. The real killer had been identified through DNA. And the person responsible had lived across the street from Angie. That detail carries an unsettling weight, because proximity is something people rarely consider after a murder. Communities imagine killers as outsiders. Strangers. People who come from somewhere else. But violence can exist much closer than anyone expects. The killer can live nearby. He can look ordinary. He can participate in everyday life. He can disappear into the same crowd as everyone else. And years later, when investigators finally identify him, people are left wondering how many times they may have passed him without knowing. That was part of the psychological shock surrounding Angie Dodge's case. The answer had not been hiding in another state. It had been much closer. And yet proximity alone could never have solved the case. Only the DNA could. That is why the genetic genealogy breakthrough became so important. It was not a lucky eyewitness. It was not a sudden confession. It was not someone recognizing an old photograph. It was a scientific chain. One relative. Then another. Then another. A family tree slowly taking shape around an unknown genetic profile. The killer's identity emerged indirectly. He was not found because he volunteered his name. He was found because his genetic relatives created a path investigators could follow. That distinction changed the future of cold case investigations. For decades, investigators had relied heavily on fingerprints, eyewitnesses, confessions, physical descriptions, and direct database matches. Genetic genealogy introduced another possibility. The suspect could be invisible, but his family could still reveal him. That concept would become one of the most powerful developments in forensic investigation. And Angie Dodge's case became part of that transformation. The case also demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence. Imagine if the biological material from 1996 had been lost. Imagine if it had been contaminated. Imagine if it had been discarded because investigators believed they already had the killer. There would have been no genetic trail. No family tree. No match. No Brian Drips. The entire second investigation depended on evidence that had survived for decades. That evidence outlived the original theory. It outlived the original conviction. It outlived the original interrogation. It outlived the investigators who had first handled the case. And eventually, it outlived the killer's anonymity. This is what makes forensic evidence so different from human memory. Memory changes. People forget. People misremember. People interpret events differently. DNA does not care about any of that. The biological evidence preserved from Angie's case remained a fixed point. The world changed around it. The evidence did not. When modern science finally examined it through a new lens, it opened a door that had been invisible for years. Behind that door was Brian Drips. The arrest brought the case back into national attention. But for Angie's mother, public attention was not what mattered. The question was simpler. Who killed my daughter? For decades, she had lived without a truthful answer. Now she had one. It was a painful answer. But it was an answer. And answers matter. Not because they erase grief. They do not. They matter because uncertainty has its own kind of cruelty. A family can live with grief. But living with an unanswered question can create a different wound. What happened? Who did it? Why? Was the person responsible still alive? Was he nearby? Could he ever be found? Those questions can repeat endlessly. Every anniversary. Every birthday. Every news report about another cold case. Every time a new forensic technique makes another impossible case suddenly solvable. For Angie's family, that uncertainty lasted more than 2 decades. Then one day it ended. The killer had a name. The DNA had a match. The innocent man had been cleared. The case had crossed from mystery into history. But the history was complicated. Because the solution revealed not only who killed Angie. It revealed how badly the original system had failed her. Angie deserved an investigation that followed the evidence. Christopher Tapp deserved an investigation that recognized the evidence pointing away from him. And the community deserved the truth. All three had been delayed. The final answer therefore carried two meanings: justice for Angie, and accountability for the failure that had harmed Tap. The story also forces an uncomfortable question about certainty. How quickly should investigators become convinced they know who committed a murder? The Angie Dodge case offers a brutal answer. Not before the evidence supports it. Because once a suspect becomes the center of an investigation, every decision afterward can be influenced by that belief. Questions are asked differently. Evidence is interpreted differently. Contradictions are explained instead of investigated. And a confession can become the final piece investigators want, even when the physical evidence is telling them to keep looking. The case is therefore not simply a triumph of forensic science. It is also a warning about human fallibility. Science did not make the original mistake. People did. Science later helped correct it. And that difference matters. Technology can provide information. Investigators must decide how to interpret it. Courts must decide how to weigh it. Attorneys must challenge it. And society must remain willing to admit when the original conclusion was wrong. For Christopher Tapp, that admission came after years that could never be restored. For Angie Dodge, it came after more than 20 years without the truth. For Brian Drips, it came after decades of freedom. 3 lives. 3 completely different consequences. 1 crime. And 1 piece of evidence that survived long enough to connect them all. The case had finally been solved. But solved did not mean healed. The apartment where Angie died could not become a place where she returned. The prison years could not become years of freedom. The lost decades could not become ordinary memories. The community could not erase what it had once believed. And a mother could not stop being a mother who had lost her 18-year-old daughter. The truth had arrived. But it arrived carrying everything that had happened while it was missing. That is why the Angie Dodge case remains so haunting. Not because the killer was impossible to find. He was not. Not because the evidence disappeared. It did not. Not because there were no clues. There were. The most haunting part is that the answer existed for years in a form nobody could yet translate. A genetic signature. A silent witness. A message waiting for the right technology. And eventually, after decades of darkness, that message became a name. Brian Drips. The man who had once been only a stranger inside a DNA database. The man whose genetic relatives created the path. The man who had lived across the street. The man whose identification finally brought the case to its long-delayed reckoning. And beneath all of that remained one fact that no forensic breakthrough could ever change. Angie Dodge was 18 years old. She should have grown older. She should have seen another birthday. Another summer. Another winter. She should have had years filled with ordinary moments that nobody would ever consider newsworthy. Instead, she became a name remembered through a murder investigation. And the people who loved her had to spend decades waiting for the world to catch up with what happened to her. The world finally did. But it took 23 years. And by then, nothing could ever be the same. By the time Brian Drips entered the public record as the man responsible for Angie Dodge's murder, the case had already become something much larger than a homicide investigation. It had become a story about memory, pressure, science, and the terrifying possibility that an investigation can reach a conclusion without reaching the truth. For Angie's family, the revelation was devastating and relieving at the same time. The person responsible had finally been identified. But the years between 1996 and 2019 could not be erased. They had become part of the case itself. For Christopher Tapp, those years were personal. He had spent approximately 2 decades inside a prison cell for a murder he did not commit. His name had been connected to Angie's for years. His conviction had existed in official records. His sentence had shaped every decision he made. And even after questions about the case became impossible to ignore, freedom did not arrive immediately. That is what makes wrongful convictions so difficult to understand from the outside. A person can be innocent and still remain imprisoned. A person can tell the truth and still not be believed. A person can be excluded by scientific evidence and still be convicted. And once a conviction exists, changing it requires more than discovering a contradiction. It requires a willingness to admit that the original conclusion was wrong. The Angie Dodge case forced that admission. The first version of the story had been simple. Angie was murdered. Christopher Tapp was identified as the offender. He was convicted. The case appeared closed. But the second version was far more disturbing. Angie was murdered. An unknown male left biological evidence. Tapp was interrogated and eventually confessed. He was convicted despite the DNA evidence excluding him. The unknown man remained free. And for years, the real question was buried underneath the conviction. Who was the man whose DNA had been left behind? That question became the center of the renewed investigation. As forensic genetic genealogy developed, investigators gained a new way to approach the unknown profile. Instead of waiting for a direct match, they could search for relatives and reconstruct family relationships. It was detective work performed through genetics, with the family tree replacing the traditional suspect list. The process could be slow. It could be uncertain. Could produce false leads. But it could also reach places traditional searches could not. A person could remain absent from law enforcement databases and still have relatives whose genetic information pointed toward them. That possibility transformed the meaning of the old evidence. For 20 years, the DNA profile had essentially said, "This is the man." But it could not say his name. Now, through genealogy, investigators could begin asking another question. Who is his family? That question eventually led investigators toward Brian Drips. The connection was not based on a single dramatic discovery. It was the result of genetic relationships being mapped, tested, narrowed, and examined. Then investigators found the geographical connection. Drips had lived across the street from Angie's apartment. The distance was astonishingly small. The killer, who had seemed to disappear into the vastness of the country, had not necessarily gone far at all. He had been part of the same neighborhood. The realization must have transformed the way investigators viewed the old case. Every map, every street, every address, every name, every old lead. The geography of the crime suddenly had a new meaning. And yet, even with a promising suspect, investigators still needed direct evidence. That was one of the lessons learned from the first investigation. Theory was not enough. A confession was not enough. A possibility was not enough. The evidence had to speak. So investigators obtained a DNA sample connected to Drips. The laboratory comparison provided the answer. The DNA matched. The unknown male profile from the original investigation was connected to Brian Drips. The mystery had finally been reduced to a name. And with that name came the collapse of the old story. Christopher Tapp could no longer reasonably remain at the center of Angie's murder. The science had drawn a line between him and the biological evidence. Another man stood on the other side of that line. The legal process moved toward correcting the injustice. Tapp's murder conviction was vacated. The charges were dismissed. He was cleared. But the word cleared can sound deceptively clean. It suggests a slate wiped blank. For Tapp, there was no blank slate. There were 20 years behind him. 2 decades that had shaped his identity. 2 decades that had changed his relationships. 2 decades in which the rest of the world had continued moving while he remained trapped inside a system built around a conviction that was ultimately wrong. When he finally stepped into freedom, he was not returning to the life he had left. That life was gone. The people around him had aged. Technology had transformed everyday existence. The world of 1996 had become a memory. And the murder that had sent him to prison had become one of the most extraordinary examples of how forensic science could eventually expose a wrongful conviction. But the public often sees only the final moment. The courtroom. The announcement. The arrest. The handcuffs. The headlines. What it does not always see are the years between those moments. The legal motions. The evidence reviews. The unanswered letters. The waiting. The uncertainty. The emotional exhaustion. The constant need to prove what should never have needed proving. Tapp had to live through all of that before the official record finally caught up with the truth. And while he was doing it, Angie's mother was fighting a different battle. Carol Dodge had lost her daughter. There is no legal remedy for that. No exoneration can change it. No DNA match can reverse it. No conviction can restore the person who was killed. But the identification of the real killer answered one question that had haunted her for decades. Who did this? The answer was Brian Dripps. And that answer came with another revelation. The person responsible had not been a mystery figure from another world. He had lived nearby. He had existed within the same community. He had been part of the same physical landscape. That proximity is one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. People often imagine that a killer disappears because he runs. Sometimes he does. But sometimes he does not need to. Sometimes he simply returns to ordinary life. He goes to work. He shops for groceries. He talks to neighbors. He pays bills. He grows older. He watches the news. And if the investigation points toward someone else, the danger of exposure may begin to feel smaller with every passing year. The first few years after a murder may be frightening. Then 5 years pass. Then 10. Then 15. Eventually, the case becomes an old story. A cold case. A photograph in a newspaper archive. A name that fewer people remember. The fear begins to fade. That may be what happened around Angie Dodge's murder. But the evidence never forgot. The biological material preserved from the original investigation remained available. The DNA profile remained. The technology changed. And the case waited. This is why cold cases can be so deceptive. They may look dormant. They may look abandoned. But dormant is not the same as dead. A case can remain active inside evidence long after investigators stop actively working it. A fingerprint can survive. A photograph can survive. A letter can survive. A digital file can survive. And DNA can survive long enough to outlive an entire generation of investigative technology. The Angie Dodge case demonstrated that principle with extraordinary clarity. In 1996, investigators had DNA but no name. In the years that followed, investigators had suspects but no scientifically supported identification. Eventually, they had genetic genealogy. Then they had a family connection. Then they had a geographic connection. Then they had a direct DNA match. The sequence was slow. But it was logical. The evidence gradually narrowed the possibilities until the unknown man became Brian Dripps. And then came the question that every cold case investigation eventually faces. Why did it take so long? The answer is uncomfortable because there was no single reason. There was the limitation of technology. There was the focus on Christopher Tapp. There was the power of the confession. There were investigative assumptions. There were legal barriers. There was the absence of a direct database match. There was simply the passage of time. Each factor became another layer between the crime and the truth. Together they created a wall. Modern forensic science eventually found a way around that wall. But the damage behind it had already been done. The case became a reminder that the criminal justice system is operated by human beings. And human beings can make mistakes. Investigators can make mistakes. Prosecutors can make mistakes. Defense attorneys can make mistakes. Witnesses can make mistakes. Jurors can make mistakes. Even judges can make mistakes. The goal of justice is not to pretend those mistakes are impossible. The goal is to create a system capable of discovering and correcting them. The Angie Dodge case shows both sides of that principle. The system failed Christopher Tapp. But later, the system listened to new evidence. The conviction was challenged. The DNA was reconsidered. The investigation was reopened. Genetic genealogy was used. The real killer was identified. The conviction was vacated. The record was corrected. The process was painfully slow. But it moved. And that movement matters. Because if the case had never been reopened, Tapp might have remained imprisoned and Drips might have remained unidentified. The truth would still have existed. But it might have remained inaccessible. That is the strange relationship between truth and evidence. Truth does not require anyone to believe it. It exists whether people recognize it or not. But justice does require recognition. Someone must be willing to look again. Someone must be willing to question the old answer. Someone must be willing to say, "We may have been wrong." That sentence can be difficult in any investigation. In a murder case, it can be devastating. But without it, wrongful convictions can become permanent. Angie Dodge's case eventually reached that point. The old answer could no longer survive the new evidence. Christopher Tapp was innocent. Brian Drips was connected to the crime. The DNA was the bridge between those two realities. And behind all of it was Angie, the young woman whose death had started everything. She had no control over the investigation. No control over the interrogation. No control over the trial. No control over the years that followed. Yet her DNA became the most persistent witness in the entire case. It survived when memories failed. It survived when theories changed. It survived when the wrong man was convicted. It survived when the case became cold. And eventually, it helped identify the person responsible. There is something almost hauntingly poetic about that. The evidence left behind by the victim became the evidence that outlasted the killer's anonymity. The killer could remain silent. He could avoid investigators. He could watch years disappear. But he could not change his genetic signature. And he could not change the fact that it had been preserved. The technology of the future was already waiting inside the evidence of the past. When that technology finally arrived, the case began moving again. Brian Drips was no longer an invisible figure. He was a person investigators could name. Person prosecutors could charge. A person the courts could hold accountable. And for the first time, the public could separate the real offender from the man who had spent years wrongly associated with the crime. That distinction matters because names have consequences. Angie's name had been attached to a murder. Tapp's name had been attached to a conviction. Drips's name eventually became attached to the crime. The correction did not change history. It changed the understanding of history. And sometimes that is what justice looks like after decades. Not a dramatic ending. Not a perfect restoration. Just the truth finally occupying the place where a false story had once stood. For Angie's mother, that truth could never be enough. For Tapp, it could never repay the years. For investigators, it became a lesson. For forensic science, it became an example. And for the public, it became a warning. Because somewhere, even now, other cold cases may contain the same kind of silent evidence. A DNA profile that has no name. A fingerprint that has never been matched. A digital trace nobody understood at the time. A piece of evidence sitting quietly in storage while technology moves forward. The question is not always whether the evidence exists. Sometimes the question is whether anyone will look at it again. Angie Dodge's case proves that looking again can change everything. a conviction can fall. An innocent person can walk free. A killer can finally be named. And a family can finally hear the answer they have been waiting for. But the answer may arrive decades late. And when it does, it may bring as much pain as relief. Because solving the case does not mean the past disappears. It means the past finally becomes understandable. The mystery becomes history. The unknown man becomes Brian Drips. The wrongly convicted man becomes Christopher Tapp, exonerated. And Angie Dodge remains what she always was beneath the case files and headlines. An 18-year-old woman whose life should have continued. Her story stopped. The investigation did not. It traveled through interrogations, courtrooms, laboratories, databases, family trees, and decades of uncertainty. And eventually it reached the truth. But the truth had taken its time. 23 years. That was how long the killer remained unidentified. 20 years. That was how long Christopher Tapp remained imprisoned. One life was taken in an instant. Another was taken year by year. And the evidence that connected them both remained silent until science learned how to make it speak. That is the part of Angie Dodge's story that refuses to disappear. The killer was caught. The innocent man was cleared. The case was solved. But beneath those three statements is a much darker reality. Justice delayed can become justice transformed. And sometimes when the truth finally arrives, the question is no longer simply who committed the crime. The question becomes how many lives were changed while everyone was looking in the wrong direction.